Sananda, welcome.
Hello. Nice shirt, Steve.
Hi.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, so this is a lovely shirt. Well, thanks for joining us. Before we get started, please introduce yourself to our viewers. Tell them what you do at AWS. I'll put my teeth back.
Totally. My name is Sananda. I'm a senior product manager, and I work very closely with Steve on .NET, and we focus on really looking at .NET workloads and making sure they run the best on AWS in every way possible.
I'm sorry, I have to show this comment. It's just awesome. Yeah, woo .NET. All right, so Toolkit for .NET Refactoring. Yeah, of course I am here. Toolkit for .NET Refactoring. So it's part of our set of .NET modernization tools, right? But a lot of people probably aren't familiar. What is .NET modernization, right? I mean, it's still a modern language, C#, right? It's still evolving, etc. But what is .NET modernization itself?
Yeah, totally. So for this, let's look at some of the history of .NET. So .NET really started with this Windows-based platform, which was called .NET Framework. Decades ago, when it started, it was really only meant to run on Windows, right? Windows websites, Windows applications running on Windows. What happened more recently is that the .NET Framework world kind of moved and progressed to become this cross-platform open version of .NET, which is now just called .NET. So the modern .NET can run on Windows, can run on Linux, can run on Mac too. So that's why it's called cross-platform. So when we talk about modernization, what we're really talking about is, taking those decades-old .NET framework applications that were written to run on only Windows and getting them in a more modern version of .NET so that they can run on, Linux, Mac instances, or on Windows still if they want to be. So this movement of the legacy .NET Windows-based .NET to the cross-platform .NET is what we really refer to as modernization. Okay,
so you mentioned like moving from Windows to Linux, but what are the benefits of doing that, right? So I've got an existing app. I'm going to be challenging here, right? I have an existing app. It works.
Yeah.
Right. Why would I want to move it? Why would I want to modernize it?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest reasons that we kind of see customers cite is, when you're running on Windows, you're stuck with the licensing costs that you have to pay. So even if you want to think about, potential ways to save your costs and get rid of some of the licenses, you really have to move to the open source and Linux sort of version so that you're getting rid of that licensing cost. So biggest driver that we see is ultimately, that cost savings motivation. Get rid of, the tied to Windows and then run it on more open source platforms. The other reason also why we kind of see customers do it is, you have your old legacy Windows .NET Framework application, and with more and more development happening in the clouds, the move to containers, the move to serverless, you really are, if you want to leverage the more modern versions of, all the features and benefits of running on cloud, really, you're kind of stuck at this point. If your application works, sure, but you can really leverage the latest and greatest of everything that AWS has to offer, right? If you're just stuck in your legacy sort of application. So the ability to sort of containerize and leverage the more optimized features of the cloud comes in handy when you have made that modernization to a newer version of .NET and can run on, Linux or modern platforms. And then the one big thing that we've seen is, so .NET Framework, that legacy Windows-based version, has become sort of in this maintenance mode only. So, there isn't any active development of new features going on. So if you have an application that, you just you don't know how it works, but it works, and you want to just leave it aside, maybe you can leave that in .NET Framework. But for most active development, if you're still, working and developing on your applications, you really can't leverage any new features of the .NET ecosystem either, if you continue to stay in .NET Windows. So
they call that keep the lights on mode, right? So
exactly. So it really depends on, if you have your 30-year-old application that's doing something, you don't want to touch it, then probably you can keep it on .NET Framework. But for most applications that you're running to continue to build, develop, and improve that handles business logic, you're kind of stuck if you don't move that over to the .NET where active feature development and improvements are happening, every year or so.
Yeah. So if I have a question, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
So you mentioned, Sundana, you mentioned containers and Linux and cross-platform. What are some of the challenges with moving a .NET framework or .NET application, a modern .NET, over into like a Linux container, for example?
Yeah, so there's many layers of challenges, right? Like you're moving your .NET Framework application first to .NET 6 or .NET 7, any cross-platform .NET version. So to do that, your application doesn't have one-to-one compatibility in the packages and functions it's referencing. So the first challenge is really you have to know that how your decades-old application works. We often hear customers kind of come in and say, somebody 20 years ago wrote this .NET Windows application, and I have no idea how it even works because the person is not there. We don't touch it, it works. So
that takes me back to the application architecture diagram I was talking about in the previous segment.
Exactly. So just understanding how your legacy application works itself is a challenge because you don't know the inventory, you don't know all the packages that are being referenced, right? Even if you know that and you're familiar with the application, the next task you have is you have to figure out, maybe some of my NuGet packages don't work right off the bat in .NET 6 or .NET 7. So now I have to think about, okay, what is the equivalent version to make sure that it can run on cross-platform? How do I know that? And let's say even that this is my package A moves to package B so that it can run on .NET 6 or 7. Then you also have to do all the code changes, right? So it's a non-trivial task to make sure your code is refactored to run with .NET 6. And then you're talking about a lot of these legacy Windows applications. They're coming from either on-prem or maybe running on Windows instances. So now you're also moving to this container model where the developer may not really know how that actually works. The barriers of learning about containers, creating a Docker image, containerizing, and all of those learning barriers continue to add up. So you can see there's many, many layers to this challenge. If I have an application sitting in Windows on EC2 instance Windows or on premises that's running on .NET, to get that over to a Linux container on AWS has like many, many layers of challenges.
Yeah, there's a lot of work involved there. In fact, I was going to go back to the comment I was going to make was when you were talking about performance, with modern .NET versions, there's been a lot of work put into like ARM64.
Yes.
Right. But to take advantage of that on our Graviton chips, you've got to modernize that framework application.
Exactly.
So
you see all of these really cool features and benefits and cost savings down the road, but to get to that destination, you really have to make sure that the first thing you do is move that over to cross-platform.
Yeah. So let's talk about how we actually get there. So where does the toolkit come in?
Exactly. So after all of these, I talked about so many problems. So let's talk about some of the solutions.
Talk about some good things.
Exactly. So some good things. So what we did is the toolkit is an extension for Visual Studio. So what it does, it looks at you basically the input is a source code of your .NET Framework application. And what it really does is it looks at your application, it scans it, and then it gives you that first, we talked about knowing what my application composition is in terms of all the packages that are referenced. So it gives you sort of a list of, the inventory of all the packages that you have. And then it also maps it to its knowledge base to know and sort of mention to you which ones are compatible and which ones are not. Say I want to move my application to .NET 6. So I run an assessment through the toolkit, and it would tell you, hey, package A is compatible. Package B is not compatible. And the next thing it does, it recommends how to make it compatible. So it suggests change that package B to package B 1.4. And then you're good to go on .NET 6 or Linux. So it sort of does this analysis and recommendation. And then we also talk about, making the code changes. So the next step it does is it actually goes and updates your project reference files. So where it has the knowledge of how to get rid of that incompatibility, it'll go ahead and make the changes itself in Visual Studio. So you click on sort of a port feature, and then it makes the changes. And then once you do that, you want to sort of validate some of the changes. You can do that and run locally, but you can also, with the toolkit, have the ability to quickly generate sort of a test application environment on a Linux container that's running on AWS. So now you have that whole pipeline of taking an application on Windows, assessing it, converting it, and then deploying it to AWS through just the Visual Studio extension. So you really don't have to leave the IDE to do all of this.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So one thing that we really like on this show, and I know Aaron particularly likes, is demos.
Yes.
Demos.
So can you show us?
Yeah, totally. So again, we're going to do a live demo here. So
not that I didn't know there was a demo coming, but
Of course. So here I have the Visual Studio, and I've loaded a simple commerce applications available on GitHub. You can kind of a basic e-commerce application. So this application is, I'm starting with a .NET Framework 4.8 application to really show you sort of the starting point and how it sort of analyzes and gives recommendation. So the first thing, I mean, I have the extension installed, but you can go to manage extensions and then install the extension. So this is the extension. And the first thing I've sort of done is just run an assessment. We talked about the toolkit sort of looking at your code and then giving recommendations. So I've run an assessment, and here you can see it gives a lot of details and metrics about your applications. So what it's basically here summarizing is, it's taking a look at all the NuGet packages that are present in your framework application. And then it's also sort of telling you, you have 62 NuGet packages, out of which 41 are incompatible. That's quite a high compatibility. It's more than 50%, but it's giving you that starting point to tell you, this is what your application looks like, and this is what the incompatible subset looks like. And the same it does for sort of the APIs within the packages and referenced all over as well. It scans it, it gives you the inventory of that, and then it tells you what's incompatible. So the thing I did previously is like check for compatibility against .NET 6, because that's my desired version. Now you can also check that for .NET 7, which is the more latest release of the cross-platform .NET. So you specify your version, and then it'll check for compatibility against that version. So, but this summary is great, but I also want to see all the list of packages that I have, right? So once you click on the incompatibilities, what it gives you is, a second level of details. So here you can see, all the NuGet packages that are there, 7 pages of just NuGet packages.
7 pages of packages. Wow. That's a lot of hand editing of project files.
I know. So
that's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and it's this is not even the most complex application, because what we talked about, the legacy applications that come in, they've had decades of contributions being made. And so it becomes really this giant complex monolith that nobody really knows how it works. And so what it's doing is giving you a line-by-line item of all the packages that you have in your current framework application, some information about the versions, the number of projects that it's referenced in. But really the key recommendation is coming in these 2 columns, right? What it's doing is it's telling you whether that package is compatible or not against the .NET 6 version I had indicated. And then it's also looking at, hey, here's a recommendation to make it compatible if it's not compatible. Okay. So it suggests the replacement as well, where it has the knowledge. So in a lot of cases, what also happens is you have some custom packages that the toolkit may not be aware of yet. So it may mark it as an unknown sort of package, but where it has the knowledge that we're constantly sort of improving over time, it gives you recommendations. And sort of the similar thing for APIs as well, kind of get the same level of information.
So these are the APIs, these are the API namespaces used and classes used inside the app that it's analyzing?
Exactly, yes. All the APIs that are used inside the application.
I saw the APIs tab, and I thought that's pretty cool, because this compatibility assessment is breaking things down from not just like a dependency standpoint, but also maybe even an API standpoint, and any risks that might need to be fixed or patched or updated or something to make it a successful migration and modernization project.
Exactly. And sometimes we have customers who say, I don't even know I was using this API. Actually, this is not even part of the application that I needed. So I'm just going to disregard all of these, which is also fine, right? It's for the customer to really be aware of what's happening in their application today in the legacy.
This makes me think, because way back in the day, I used to be a sysadmin, and I was responsible for audits. And I can only imagine that this can maybe also be a toolkit that people can use and leverage for some kind of audits on their application level too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even if there's some critical, security vulnerability or some packages that you shouldn't be using, you can sort of flag and sort of audit that too. That's a really good point too.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because you got that export as CSV there, right? So you could theoretically drive this and capture that. So that's an interesting use case I hadn't even thought of. Nice.
So just the assessment and the visualization and the reports itself has a lot of different use cases and value that we see sort of start coming up. And the other thing that it also does within the IDE is really give you this very complex, again, graph of what's all the projects and all the references to each project. So you can kind of see what we sort of see customers decide, this is again meant to give you an overview of how your application looks like today, what are the incoming and outgoing dependencies for each project. The way we sort of see customers starting to use this is you can see the SNOP services has a lot of references, incoming and outgoing, but then you also see some outlier projects that have far fewer. So when you actually decide, I'm ready to make that porting and make that change to .NET 6, you can decide whether you want to tackle, like the most complex one first, or maybe start with the easier outliers first, right? So kind of also gives them, it of course gives you an overview of how your application looks like and all the cross dependencies within projects, but then it also helps you sort of decide what strategy you want to take. You want to start fan in, fan out, how you want to start with this.
Yeah, I can imagine that from a developer perspective, if you're new to porting and modernizing, then you might want to start with one that has smaller dependencies and get some confidence and get that flywheel going.
Yes.
Alternatively, you might want to start with a project that's heavily dependent on, so you get the most bang for your buck immediately from the port, right? So there's kind of two sides of the fence there, and this helps. I can see how this helps guide, which side you want to start from,
Yeah, so it's really depends on the developer how they want to do it, but it's, the intent is to at least give them a starting point to make that decision. Right. So this is sort of, all of this is a part of, the assessment overview and helping you understand your legacy application. The next step is
talking about the assessment and like porting assistance and so forth, but let's say if there's a developer who, I don't know, maybe has an application and they want some way to validate that application. Can this help with that as well?
Exactly. So after a lot of the assessment, and then you kind of have two options, so you want to actually go ahead and make the port changes. So you can either port the entire solution and it will port all the projects, or you can port selected projects one by one that we talked about, right? Based on, the least dependent project first, the smaller project, or the most complex first. So it's really up to the customer. But let's say you've gone ahead and ported, and what the toolkit will do is apply those changes where it has recommendations, updating your project, CS project files. So once you've done that, you want to validate this. Say your end goal is running on containers on AWS. That whole jump from a framework, Windows-based on-premise or EC2 instance application to Linux application on ECS is many, many jumps, right? So what the toolkit also offers you is right from, again, the Visual Studio, just run sort of a test deployment on the AWS container environment so that you can sort of see that the application is, the form factor, if you have a website, it's, working as expected on Linux and on containers. So once you've sort of done the porting and made the code changes, what you can do is you can hit this run test deployment.
So while that runs, actually, I want to go back to something you just cheerfully skipped over.
I saw that too.
So you mentioned updating the project file, right? I know from experience that is a significant amount of effort because there's a different project file format in modern .NET to what was in .NET Framework.
Yes.
Right. So going in and updating all those NuGet project references and formatting that file and removing all the stuff it doesn't need anymore is a huge amount of time and effort.
Yep.
But this is just done for you.
Yes. So the biggest value prop is really reducing that manual work for the customer, right? Is by deleting some of the files you don't need, changing the template and the structure so that it's .NET 6 or .NET 7, whichever version you want, compatible. So not only is it giving you all the information you need, it's also going ahead and making the changes for you. So it's sort of this, advisor and sort of a helper to make the changes for you. And so
I saw a question earlier also that's kind of related to this topic. Let's say you have some kind of get change or a commit or something. Can you trigger this .NET refactoring dashboard to kind of work through that change process?
Yeah, so you can, if you have a git change, you can start tracking some of those changes there and then plug in the dashboard. As long as you're working within Visual Studio, because it's Visual Studio extension, you can run an assessment and then it will pick up wherever you are, and then you can continue to track changes through git changes within Visual Studio. So
got it. So the key is use Visual Studio and then you can do it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so I'll quickly show the test deployment also so that you kind of are aware. So all the changes the toolkit has made and sort of updated your project files. One thing I do want to mention is that, it's not a silver bullet in terms of once you do hit the porting and the toolkit makes the changes, in almost every case, there might be few outliers. We talk about some custom packages, private packages that the toolkit doesn't have the visibility into. So there will almost always be some changes that manually you have to make. But other than that, toolkit will do a lot of the updating and project reference file changes in the code. And then you can, just with providing some of the basic information, start a test deployment. And then you can sort of see your application running on containers. So here you have a form. It asks for some basic, the name of the project, the S3 bucket, and the VPC. And then using that, you can just test the application on AWS. So I actually have, once you
it does the build for you, right? Does the build, the packaging, deploys it?
Yep.
You get the URL, you go hit it.
You don't have to worry about a Docker container. You don't have to worry about any of the processes. It'll create the image, it'll push it to ECR, and the end you get two sort of outputs. So you get the deployment stack. We'll create a CloudFormation stack for you. So you can click it, you can view the resources in your management console. It'll take you directly to your management console. And then you get the endpoint URL that's running on ECS through Fargate. So you can kind of see the endpoint URL running not locally on AWS. And then also, if you want to view the CloudFormation stack, make edits, you also get the link to the CloudFormation stack. So overall, Overall, that's how the toolkit sort of takes your application, does an assessment, gives you insights, does the work to make the code changes for you, so you can kind of sit back and relax for most of the part, and then also does the work to actually spin up the deployment on AWS containers.
Can I go back to I'm going to ask you a question. I hope I'm not out of order here. I'm kind of curious. When it comes across a code change like an API use that it can't update automatically, how does it help you with that change? Does it annotate it in any way? So you kind of have an indication of what to go do? Or
so what it will do is, once you click on port, it will go ahead and port whatever it can. But let's say, out of the 41, it's able to port 30. Here it can port all of them. But let's say it's able to port 30, and then 11 you still have to do some manual changes yourself. So you can reassess the solution after you'd hit the porting, and it will update the numbers to only call out now the ones where it doesn't have the knowledge or suggestion to do so. So now you only get a smaller subset of the packages where you have to sort of manually do the changes.
Okay. But what about the code itself? So if I have code that's calling an API, does it annotate anything in the code, like a comment of like, you need to change?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it does do that. Okay.
Yeah. So if you go here, it has the green sort of underlines and some of the components in your code files itself. If I go to, there you go. So it's annotating the TR001, 002 are the error codes where you're actually getting all the annotations from Toolkit in the code, in the source code and the files.
Okay.
So you'll continue to get those reference. Wherever you see the green underlines is really where it is analyzing your code, giving you recommendations if it has some.
Okay. And that's where I have to go in and make some changes.
Exactly. And you're making the code changes. So it'll continue to track and flag. If you're making the code changes and you're typing out a package or a name that's now going to be compatible with .NET 6, it will actually tell you that too.
That's helpful.
So it flags it and adds a comment. And so that way Steve here knows exactly where to go and fix stuff in his .NET, because he loves .NET so much. He wants to spend more time in .NET.
Exactly. I love .NET too, just as much.
Who wouldn't?
So I don't have the short yet, but I'll get it.
No, this is super cool. Thanks, Ananda, for coming on and showing us the toolkit. That is great. Before we leave you, because we're getting close to time, is there anything you want to say to the viewers about where to go to get started, or discuss .NET modernization in general?
Yeah, so I'll mention two things. To get started, you can just go to Visual Studio Marketplace, type in AWS Toolkit for .NET Refactoring, and go ahead and try it. And like I said, Steve is wearing the shirt, and you have me also. So we have a large team of focused just on .NET stuff at AWS. So reach out to us. We have a Twitter too, .NET on AWS. And if you have questions, concerns, feedback, that's sort of a great way to also engage with the team.
Yeah, we should also mention as well, this is a free toolkit, right?
Yes.
This is a free extension of Visual Studio.
Totally free to use, no charge. You can just download it and get it going.
Yeah, obviously, if you deploy something, that's different. But to get started with the porting, it's free.
Yes.
Steve, you just woke up my Echo device, because my wake word from Echo device is free. So now it's listening. Thanks a lot.
Did you just change your background colors? I felt like you changed your background colors. It seems to have gone purple.
It's probably just the white balance. I mean, I can change it.
No, I was just curious. I remember that purple being like associated with .NET, with the original logo. So I thought you were doing that. I was like, come on,
you know what?
.NET.
Here, I'll match your shirt, kinda.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks so much, Sananda, for coming on. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.